Selena dreams of being broken in Dovier and is saved by Cale waking her to the day of Samhain. Though she's able to spend her time with her friends in the palace throughout the day, Selena is confined to her bedroom during the evening's festivities. But a phantom breeze calls Selena's attention to a draft in her room, which leads her to a hidden door safeguarding secret passages to forgotten parts of Rifthold Stone Castle. During her illicit exploration, Selena uncovers a secret route to escape the castle and a hidden window to spy on the Great Hall. When she realizes Cale is returning to check on her, Selena rushes back to her room, where Cale and Dorian both pay her an unexpected visit. But the night's adventures don't end there, and Selena is greeted by her dead ancestor, Fate, and the evil that lurks beneath the castle. The morning brings ill tidings of another death of a king's champion.
Hey there, we're Book Talk for Book Talk with Jac and Amy, your book besties who take the novels you love seriously.
We embrace and respect modern fantasy, romance, and romantasy books written by women, and so it's in our nature to analyze these books as we would any other novel we might have dissected in school.
With our combined 13 years of literary academic training, we use our education to analyze and give voice to the reasons why you may love or hate today's popular books.
This week, we're discussing chapters 23 through 26 of Sarah J. Maas's debut novel, Throne of Glass. For a complete list of episodes and chapter breakdowns, be sure to check out our Instagram at the handle BookTok for BookTok.
Before we dive in, let's talk about S.P.I.L.T. God, I will never... That stands for... I know, we could
might
easily
have to
change this.
We can change it to split. We're going to get rid...
No. I'm doing this. I'm going to learn it by the end. This stands for spoilers, perspective, interpretation, language, and themes.
Spoilers. While our discussion is about Throne of Glass, important context from the first three novels in the series will be discussed without spoiler warnings. That is specifically Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, and Heir of Fire. This is not a read-along for anyone who hasn't read the first three books, and you will be spoiled from here on out. So please, take this as your only spoiler warning. For all other spoilers beyond Heir of Fire and other SJM works, we will keep those to the Breadcrumbs and Broomsticks area at the end of the episode.
Perspective and interpretation. What we discuss in this episode are strictly our personal interpretations of the text. We do not speak for Sarah J. Maas and in no way know her intentions for her books or characters. We also know our listeners have their own personal views and opinions, and we encourage you to share your thoughts with us because every perspective and interpretation is worth exploring.
Language. Even though Jac tries to keep her swearing to a minimum for the sake of Maria, explicit language does occur, and it's mostly my fault.
Maria is my mother. Shout out, Mom. Themes. We also discuss some heavy subjects throughout the podcast that can include themes of sex, violence, abuse, depression, self-harm, and death. While we will do our best to give trigger warnings for the darker themes, we will discuss these topics when they are important to the text. Listener discretion is advised.
As always, we love keeping the conversation going because our listeners are so good at finding things we've overlooked or missed completely. You can share your interpretation of the text with us by posting on social media, tagging us in stories, sending us DMs, or submitting to the form on our website. We also post more exclusive content and host live streams for our Patreon supporters. You can find us at patreon.com/BookTok for BookTok. This week, we're at the halfway point of the book, and so we want to take a moment to discuss the character development of our three characters, Selena, Cale, and Dorian, and we'll leave that for the end of the episode.
Themes we're going to see in this section include religion and destiny.
Are you not reading the thread?
No, I'm saving that for later.
Okay.
I'm not going to give that away yet. That's going to be at the end of the episode. I'm going to surprise you. I mean, that's for future me.
Okay. Well,
4 hours from now.
I didn't copy it down for future use, so you're going to have to remember on your own.
Shit. Wow. No consideration for future me.
I didn't realize it was a future you thing.
There's asterisks.
That doesn't mean anything.
So before we dive in, though, I want to announce something very exciting, and that is we got tattoos.
Oh, I was like, did we discuss this beforehand?
This is my first tattoo. I never thought I would ever get a tattoo, but Amy also got a tattoo. So first you say yours and then I'll say mine.
Sure. So I got my first bookish tattoo that I swore I was going to get in October of 2022.
No.
Wow. And I got a little ornament beaded
thing
looking jewelry thing on my ribs, but there is a symbol for Feyre, Bryce, and Aelin on it.
Yeah. And then I got You do not yield on my forearm. Here's for the video, people. There's like the second skin plastic thing that's on top of it that I keep rubbing it. Uh Never thought I'd ever get it in a million years, but here we are. And the most exciting part is that it's in folklore font.
And we went to a tattoo place called State of Grace.
I'm so excited. And then I didn't think I was going to go and get a tattoo yesterday. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, so, that's, so
You had a
you're
dream.
I had a dream. I had a dream, and then it was happening into the reality. So, 0.14, I'm a psychic.
Yeah. Or you just really wanted it really bad, and your subconscious was just like, just do it, please.
We are psychics.
Put us out of our misery.
We are psychics here. So let's dive in.
All right, so we start this episode in chapter 23, and the chapter opens with Celaena back in Endovier. Now, before we get started, let's recall last week's episode where Celaena has gone through this intense, humbling process. She is learning to be more self-aware and more honest about her reality in a way that she hasn't been up until this point in the novel. When you think about it, it makes sense because we are halfway through the novel, so we would expect some sort of change in Celaena's point of view. Now, because she has been humbled, we've seen her lose confidence in her ability to secure a spot in the Final Four. That doubt is now manifesting in her dreams. And in doing so, she's envisioning a reality where she is sent back to Endovier, and it is not a good one.
No, her nightmare is almost like a premonition. Quote, the rocks stretched for miles, rising into jagged fang-like mountains that pierce the cloudy sky. What's about to happen? We're about to find out that one of the champions is half eaten, and she's getting this dream where, Endovier, which is horrible, and she doesn't want to go back there, but there's clearly something animalistic in the threat here. And then I want to look into another part of her dream. Quote, in the frigid wind, she had little clothing to protect her from its stinging gusts. As she touched the dirty rags, her stomach rose in her throat. Her nightmare, also the other layer to her nightmare, is that she's wearing little to no clothing to quite literally protect her from the weather and from threats. And I think SGM has always done a really good job when it comes to not just like what clothing represents in armor and, a state of mind of all of our characters, but also dealing with PTSD. I think that we see that like really well done when we get into Akatar and Crescent City. And I don't think I appreciated just how early she touches on that in her books.
Yeah, I agree. SJM spends so much time on Aylin's clothing, or Celaena spends so much time thinking about her clothing, that you think it's the folly of a young author, but then you realize it's actually intentional.
Yeah.
And it actually has meaning.
Yeah.
So, and because we've talked about clothing being power, the lack of clothing is also symbolic of Celaena's powerlessness in Endovier. At the end of this nightmare, Celaena has this experience. Quote, tears stung her eyes and the whip cracked as it rose again. She would be killed this time. She would die from the pain of it. Now, Celaena survived a year in Endovier, and she survived the whippings and the brutality of that situation. So when she says she'll die from the pain of it, I actually think it's more about the pain associated with the shame of failing the competition in Rifthold and being sent back to Endovier, and the disappointment of having her hopes crushed when freedom was like right in front of her. And I recognize, well, she's become more self-aware. She's more honest about her reality. Well, that's true, but I don't think that means her pride doesn't still exist. Like pride is still there to be hurt. Oh, yeah. And I think that would be the death of her ultimately.
Yeah, dreams speak so much about her mindset, because it also means that there is a certain level of acceptance that if she fails, death will meet her. Like there is no coming back for her, whether it's pride, whether it's going back to Endovier. But I think it also shows that she wants to live, especially after last episode when we were talking about her seeing that other prisoner who chose death, and, death by cop essentially. And it's, you're starting to really see that shift where she's like, no, I want to push through.
Yeah. Yeah. Where this isn't It's not just a game anymore. It's not just some stupid competition. This is her life or death.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when Selena wakes up from this nightmare, quote, she was sweating and the sweat on her back felt uncomfortably like blood. We're seeing her dream, her nightmare, and reality are starting to meld right now. And I think that's important on this day where we're going to find out it's Sam Heughan, which is significant in various cultures, and how later in chapter 26, one of the chapters, 25, 26, Selena is going to confuse dream with reality.
Mm-hmm. Also, SGM is really good at these visuals because, you may not know what it's like to have blood drip down your back, but you do know what it's like to have sweat come down your back.
Mhm.
So even if you're not entirely sure of that sensation, you are able to still feel it. And that's some good description. It's a chef's kiss, I'll say. It was a chef's kiss. Now I want to look at the moment when Selena wakes up from her nightmare and she notices that I am bringing this up to this was in Breadcrumbs, and I think I hoisted it up because I think it does really good foreshadowing that I want to touch on each time. So she notices that, quote, though her windows were shut, an odd draft from somewhere in her room kissed her face, smelling strangely of roses. We're going to see this throughout these next couple chapters, this idea of roses, the smell of roses. It's going to be a clue about the passageways. It's going to be a clue about Elena. It's going to be a lot of things leading up to it. So I think what I appreciate in SJM's in this current book is that there's a lot of foreshadowing and mirroring and bookending within chapters. So you may not get this, and we may get hints of it later, but it's all very introduced, teased out, and then wrapped up kind of within chapters.
Yeah. And I agree. I think that's a great point. She planted seeds for this early on in Selena's arrival, but the more significant details aren't introduced until they're really relevant for the reader.
Yeah. So at this moment, Cale comes in. He's the one to wake her up from this dream. Very Prince Charming waking her up, which we're going to get another reference of Sleeping Beauty, Prince Charming a little bit later. But, he's no Prince Charming. In fact, he's kind of a little bit of aggressive about it when he wakes her up. Although he gets worried and there's a little bit of concern there because he, quote, gave her a shaky smile. I thought you were being murdered. His emotions are seeping through. It's, he cares. I love it when you can find moments where the asshole character cares. And Selena, in a rare moment of honesty, and I guess it's not rare because she has been pretty honest, but in a moment of honesty that you may not expect from her, she says, quote, I was being whipped. She shook her head to remove the memory from her mind. What are you doing here? It's not even dawn. She crossed her arms, flushing slightly. So, there's this honesty. There's this moment where she's crossing her arms. She's covering herself. And that is not what we've gotten from Selena, right? We get a very cocky, we get a very, here's my body type of character. And here she is kind of folding into herself, covering and being honest. So it's, I was like, wow, we should maybe note that.
I don't know how to segue into my next point.
You just go into it.
Go into it. So it's at this point that we learn from Cale that it is Sam Heughan, which if I actually think maybe a listener brought this up ages ago in a listener thoughts long before I had read Throne of Glass. But Sam Heughan is likely derived from Samhain, which is a Gaelic festival on the 1st of November that marks the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, or the quote-unquote darker half of the year. It is also a time when they honor their ancestors, I think, which makes sense because it's also for the rest of the world, All Hallows Eve, Day of the Dead, lots of connections across different cultures here.
Yeah. And I think it's pronounced also Sam Heughan, or something similar to that, is the hot actor from Outlander, who's just really attractive and Scottish. So shout out him.
So we bring this up because it is a little bit of a breadcrumb for Selena's encounter with Elena later in this episode.
Cale continues to be super uncomfortable with Selena being an assassin. Actually, I think in this episode, I'm going to bring it up a few times of just how Cale and Dorian are uncomfortable with her being an assassin. And this holiday just makes it more clear because, again, think very Day of the Dead, think very Halloween. So there's this there's this dead person element, ghostly element to it, right? Quote, I never took you for a superstitious person. How does that fit into your career? There's this judgment into her career, and it fascinates both the men here, but they're also kind of grossed out by it. And I'm going to kind of compare it the way that like a man would almost react to a woman being interested in sex, or there's a connection and relevance between her being her being an assassin and her being a sex worker, and people might be like, wow, you be jumping. However, remember in previous episodes, Selena was the one who compared her work to that of a concubine, of being a sex worker, because she was like a sex worker, or in this world was essentially taken on very young, was brought up to be raised to sell her body in different ways, and is expected to pay it all back. So I don't think that I'm reaching here when I compare it to sex work. And I also don't think I'm reaching here when I compare it to like a guy, not all men, obviously. I hate saying that phrase. You'll hear that. That'll be the last time. But like you sometimes get these men who are very almost, I don't want to say disgusted by women's pleasure and sex. No, I'm going to say it. Yeah, disgusted by women's pleasure and sex work. And it's the fact that it's her career. And again, there's that fascination and being horrified of her choosing that. And I also, I'm going to say this early on. We find out later that Kale thinks that she's a virgin. I want to confirm, spoiler, she had sex with Sam, right?
You don't know that they did.
I'm pretty sure that they did. I even Googled it.
Okay, well, if Google says it, it must be true.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Reddit pages.
No judgment on my part.
There is an assumption there, though. So I just he is kind of fascinated with her sex and career. But, kind of staying into that theme that she has going on, quote, she glared at him over her shoulder before she strode into the bathing chamber, Kale close behind. She paused on the threshold. Are you going to join me? She said, and Kale stiffened, realizing his error. He slammed the door in response. So now Selena is back to using sex as a weapon, and also we've talked about thresholds thresholds mark a moment of shifting, of poignant moments. And I think it could be her shifting back into her use of humor and sex as armor.
Yeah. Or you could also look at it as, despite maybe a mutual attraction between them, Kale's not ready to cross that threshold into that kind of intimacy with her.
Yeah. I love that. Quick pause.
Assassin's Blade spoiler. No, she doesn't.
She doesn't have sex with who?
Sam.
I Googled the same thing.
I think they barely started to have a intimate relationship before he was killed. The reason why Selena ends up sleeping with Kale in the next book is because she waited too long with Sam and they never had the opportunity.
Oh.
And so she forces...
Is that what it's saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing on Reddit. Yeah, they don't sleep together. They're portrayed as having a close relationship.
Okay, well, actually, this will prove a different one of my points later on, even more concerningly so. But, ew, this is about to give I just want you to know, this is going to make a point I make later so much more cringy. So,
Great.
I know. Okay, so I want to pin that. Kale is fascinated with Selena's sex, like her having it.
Yeah, and whether or not it's true, he's making assumptions based on what information? No information. Just based on observing her and talking to her, but never outright asking her the question or receiving information from her about it.
Absolutely. So we'll get into that virginity talk later.
Right. And one other thing, only Dorian knows about Sam. Kale does not know about Sam.
Yeah.
So Kale, again, is making assumptions about a woman and her body and her choices on no information.
Male gaze.
Male gaze.
He is deep in his male gaze with her.
Yeah. Okay. We'll pin that. We'll come back to it. Once Selena is dressed and ready for breakfast, she meets Kale back out in her apartments and she digs into her porridge with fervor. Quote, all that was needed was a heap. No, 3 heaps of sugar and some hot cream. And okay, porridge is arguably the most boring food. And I think at least to me, is very connotative of prison. You know, it's gruel, it's just kind of grains and water, and here you go. It's boring. It's not actually very nutritious, I don't think. But in this moment, it is a balm in the aftermath of Selena's nightmare of Endovier. It's especially true because she gets to take advantage of access to cream and sugar, which are luxuries I can guarantee she didn't have an Endovier, and any prison would not necessarily provide to their prisoners. So we're seeing her use these things in excess. Like, who needs 3 heaps of sugar in their porridge?
I mean, if you talked about how gross it is, then someone who wants to eat that.
It's just basically pure sugar is what's going on right now.
I like to imagine it's similar to oatmeal.
Yeah, but runny oatmeal. Have you ever had Chinese oatmeal?
No.
It would be like that. It's very runny.
Okay.
And the only way they make it good is to pour a whole can of sweetened condensed milk in it.
Sounds delicious.
So it's just pure sugar. Anyway, right now, watching Selena eat this food, I think it's more about mental strength than physical strength for her. If we think of it from a food as power perspective, she is trying to ground herself in her reality through the use of eating food and mentally fortifying herself. This is emphasized when later Selena thinks, quote, "Oh, she loved porridge, but perhaps it needed another spoonful of sugar." Her appreciation for her plain breakfast is really an appreciation for her circumstances and her distance from Endovier. If given any other choice on any other day, Selena might have been like, "Why can't I have bacon?"
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Oh, but then because she woke up from that Endovier dream.
Mm-hmm.
I see what you're saying.
The smallest amount of nutrition and luxury is excessive for her, and she's so grateful for it.
I love it. So I want to look at that exact same moment, but through some might say a feminist lens. Everything comes back to sex with me. The quote is, "All that was needed was a heap, no, 3 heaps of sugar and some hot cream. And are you going to temple?" That's Kale who says that. "I'm allowed to go to temple, but not to the feast." She took a spoonful of the porridge. Religious observances shouldn't be denied to anyone. And the feast is a show of debauchery. "Ah, I see." She swallowed another bite. She loved porridge, but perhaps another spoonful of sugar. "Well, are you going? We need to leave soon if you are." "No," she said through her food. One of our themes that we're going to talk about is religion and the different, and even spirituality. I'm going to clump into that. And we're going to see different characters and their relationships to religion and spirituality. But what I like here is the fact that Kale discusses the feast as debauchery. And what we actually will see a little bit of the feast later, and there's no debauchery, there's just dancing and eating. It's a party.
Mm-hmm.
But Kale deems it debauchery. And what is she doing right now? She's eating excessively sweet food. She is herself in the middle of debauchery. And of course he would view food as debauchery because he views her as sex, and she is eating excessively sweet food.
And he's always remarked on how much she's capable of eating.
Exactly. So, and he is just like, just say you're horny for her. Just say you're horny for her. That's it. That's all you need to do.
Come clean.
Yeah. Stop trying to be like debauchery and food. Kale, who is very by the book, though, he's very strict. He's the one who's interested in Selena going to temple. Even though she's not invited to the feast, she's allowed to go worship. Quote, "I imagined that an assassin would take more interest in the Day of the Dead." She made a demented face as she continued. "I worship in my own way. Perhaps I'll make a sacrifice or 2 of my own." And he just won't let her assassinness go, right? He just keeps making these little digs, these little comments. And I think he's trying to understand her too, of how is it that this person that I'm growing to respect and like and horny for, how are you, the sweet, innocent little virgin, capable of such murder?
Yeah, I just put together the fact that right now Selena's saying, "I worship in my own way. Perhaps I'll make a sacrifice or 2 of my own." Tomorrow,
yeah,
Kale's gonna find a dead body.
Yeah,
that has very strong witchcraft vibes around the nature of the murder. And what does he do? He comes and is like, "Where were you last night? Where were you last night? Where were you last night?" I didn't even put that together. That Selena is Selena's setting the stage for Kale to doubt her again.
Yeah.
I'll speak more about that later.
As will I.
At the end of the scene, once Kale leaves Selena's apartments, Selena's thoughts go back to her nightmare. Quote, though she tried to forget it, the sound of the whip still snapped in her ears. Now, when I was initially reading this scene and how Selena's constantly like, oh, I love porridge. Porridge is so great. It's so good. More sugar, please. The conversation felt really off to me the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized by the end of the scene that it's less about the way S.J.M. wrote it and about not being consistent with her characters. It's more about the fact that Selena's trying to keep the conversation going and trying to distract herself and convince Kale she's fine so that she can keep thoughts of her nightmare and the whip at bay. And it's only when she's confronted with silence that the nightmare comes back.
Yeah. I love that. Also, humor is her way to fill in the silence too.
Mm-hmm.
And not have to hear the trauma. So then the second that humor is gone, the second that Kale's gone, what she hears again is her trauma.
Yeah, it's a coping mechanism.
It is. Don't I understand it?
Mm-hmm.
We then switch to Dorian's point of view, and he's also not happy about being in Temple. Quote, religion neither convinced nor moved him, and after hours of sitting in a pew, muttering prayer after prayer, he was in desperate need of some fresh air and solitude. I feel like with SJM, there is a huge theme of a religion, but not just religion, questioning religion. I feel like we see it in every single one of her series where, you and I, when we did our Crescent City analysis, book 1 and 2, you and I were just saying like book 1 felt like questioning faith and spirituality, while book 2 was the descent of falling out of spirituality and faith. And this is the same thing where we have two main characters who do not worship. However, even though we don't see Kale worshiping necessarily, I have no doubt that he is, an active participant in temple and going to these temples. But it's an interesting call out that none of her characters here, they question. They're not necessarily practicing.
I actually am going to challenge that because I think it's a breadcrumb when Selena says, I worship in my own way. I took that to mean I don't worship in the way humans do. I worship in the way that the Fae do.
So that's where I'm going to make a case later that her worship is spirituality rather than quote unquote religion.
Fair.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with you that Kale does practice religion because he's very by the book, right? He's very much like, oh, are these the rules? Okay, I will follow them.
Yeah, I think that when you look into SJM's books, and this one in particular, the characters end up leaning more towards that spiritual, the mother, the ancestors. Like that's the route that they end up kind of going.
So while we're in Dorian's point of view, we learn not only what Jac is saying about how he's really not into religion, we also learn how other people around him similarly desecrate religion. Quote, his mother had used the ceremony as a chance to point out all the eligible ladies to him. He'd spent the entire service trying not to scream at the top of his lungs. I really, really empathize as someone who grew up in a religion where they put single people in one congregation so that y'all could figure out how to get married. Didn't work for me. But let's talk about this moment from a Marxist-ish perspective. I don't know what perspective I'm talking about, but a church or temple setting should be a place of solitude and sanctuary. That's what we normally associate with church and with temple. Instead, the queen is desecrating it by using it as a platform for her wedding planning. What we're seeing then is that Dorian, maybe Kale, the queen, the court, are going to this church of a false god that nobody respects. It is just another version of court where everyone masquerades as obedient and pious members of its congregation. It's just like court. Whether or not you're loyal to the king or queen, you go to be present to convince everyone you're a good, noble person. This setting then is just another way for the queen to have power when the king is absent. It's not about worshiping ancestors or respecting the dead. It's not about respecting whatever god that they worship. It's about politics.
Yeah, it's another place to parade around.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense then why we go from Dorian listening to his mother talking about his, which woman to look into, to the very next line he runs into Selena and
Yeah.
he's like, you, I
Yep.
want you. Now let's get into Selena's dress. Amy's about to make some points on it. I'm going to make some of my points. We're going to be referencing the quotes and taking different aspects out of it. Quote, it was the color of a mountain lake, that gem-like shade that didn't quite have a name. Not to mention the dress was about 100 years out of fashion. His gaze rose to her face, and he smiled. It's beautiful, and it's out of place, just like Selena, and he is all about it. He's like, oh, you're not in fashion? That's exactly what my mother would hate. My mother would hate you. Yes, please. I want you. And, it's like she's not a lady of the court. She doesn't fit in. She is everything that he wants.
Yeah, she's not performing the way the other courtiers are performing. I just want to point out that there are multiple references to Selena's dress that are associated with water. One, Jac has already read, quote, it was the color of a mountain lake. Later on, it's also described, quote, the folds of fabric like the flowing waters of a river. Now, I made up this connection. I was like, oh, maybe it's referencing the river that carried Aelin away from Terrasen to Aderlin and brought her here. And I think it's relevant when we think about fate, because fate is going to be a topic at the end of the episode. And that river really plays into Selena's fate and how she got from princess to assassin. But I think there are also other reasons why this dress has water references that I'll save for later.
I can't remember your note. So if I'm taking your note, you can, I'll edit this out. But, it makes sense because she's going to explore the tunnels in that dress.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. Amy's note for later. Now, Dorian is looking at this dress and he is just thinking it is out of fashion, but damn, she's hot. Now, if we actually listen to what Selena says, we can hear what it represents, in my mind. Quote, Lady Lillian's servants were attending the service when she dressed, said Cale. There was nothing else to wear. Of course, corsets required assistance to get in and out of, and the dresses were labyrinths of secret clasps and ties. I love that Cale's the one who answers for Selena, because it's almost like she's just so annoyed that she's even in this dress to begin with, that he's the one who has to tell her. I also have this mental image of Selena storming around in her closet being like, I have nothing to wear. Cale, can you tie me up? And he's like, I can't do anything. Like, that's scary. I can't touch you. And then she's like, damn it, this is the only thing I have left. But all fun moments aside, her clothing shows a product of her situation and that she is still a prisoner. Her help was not there. She does not have ladies' maids. She does not have assistants. She is at the whims of the palace. And because of that, she had no one to help her. It is not freeing. It's a reminder that she has no power. And in this case, her clothes show a lack of armor, a lack of power.
Mm-hmm. I also want to point out the fact that it's Dorian who's thinking, well, of course she can't do it on her own. There's a secret labyrinth of clasps and ties.
Yeah.
Because he's a fuckboy and he knows because he's helped take those dresses off.
And of course, Cale would never know because he's too innocent and pure.
Yeah.
I also just want to call this out so I can come back to this later. Quote, No, he said quickly, glancing at her feet. They were clad in red shoes, red like the winter berries beginning to pop out on the bushes. You look very nice, just a bit out of place. What I'm noting here are those red shoes. Red. We're going to get a couple of red references. And just a reminder, red has been continuously associated with bad things, with evil, with his father. And we're seeing them kind of like, popping out of winter bushes, which is like white and pure. So, just kind of keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Nice visual.
Yep.
I can't remember if this is when Dorian is still with Selena or if it's after they part, but he ruminates on the fact that Duke Parrington has a plan to use Nehemia to his advantage by keeping her hostage in Aderlin. Quote, not particularly inclined to add hostage taking to his repertoire of abilities, Dorian had spent hours arguing against it. But while some of the council members had also voiced their disapproval, the majority seemed to think the Duke's strategy to be a sound one. Still, Dorian had convinced them to back off about it until his father returned. that would give him time to win over some of the Duke's supporters. Deep down, we see Dorian's actually a good guy. And I think it's extra good because he doesn't advertise it. He doesn't talk to Kale about it. He doesn't talk to Selena about it or Nehemia. He's trying to do what he feels is his responsibility by saying, that's morally incorrect. We're not going to keep a princess hostage just for our own political gain. Unfortunately, though, his efforts are not attached to meaningful power. He has to borrow the power of his father, saying, my father isn't here, let's wait for him, in order to salvage time to play the political games for Nehemia's sake.
Mhm.
So he's a good guy. Unfortunately, he's not capable of much.
I can confirm that this is when they're all still together because he looks at Nehemia and he thinks all of this. And I was surprised because I was thinking, wow, Dorian is really stepping it up and as a prince. You know, we keep harping on him about not being a prince and that he just sits there and is bitching about his boring life. And hey, you can go be a prince. And now he kind of is. Quote, if he were anyone but the crown prince, he would warn her. But if Nehemia left before she was supposed to, the Duke would know who had told her and inform his father. Things were bad enough between Dorian and the king. He didn't need to be branded as a rebel sympathizer. So it's to a point, right? Like he is growing and helpful to of Nehemia to a point because he doesn't want to risk things. He doesn't want to come up with a different elaborate plan to help her get out. But again, we're getting a little bit more strategy from him than we ever had before. And we then suddenly get to see him use his brain. I haven't seen him use his brain this entire book, especially when he says why he isn't going to take Selena to the feast. Now, however, he doesn't actually say it. He thinks this part. Quote, he couldn't bring her to the feast, not with so many watching. There would be too many questions, not to mention too many people. Keeping track of her would be difficult. It's just funny how they feel like they couldn't tell her that. You know, where they had to like keep that a secret of, you know, that's valid, you know, saying, look, we can't get, I'm sorry, you can't go. You have to stay in. It's just going to bring in too many questions. Instead, it's just a, you are forbidden to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yay, miscommunication trope. Or lack of communication.
I think it's withholding entirely.
Withholding. Yeah. What I appreciate about Dorian at this point in the story is that we're seeing his goodness, but we're seeing how his lack of power holds him back from really delivering on his goodness, right? I think that if he had a greater position of power, if he weren't, you know, if his wings weren't clipped by his father per se, he could do whatever the fuck he wanted.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have the power to control Selena. Selena knows it. He doesn't have the power to convince everyone that he's not a rebel sympathizer. So he is looking out for himself right now more than he's looking out for anybody else. And quite frankly, I don't blame him.
Yeah.
When we've seen just how powerless he is.
Yes. I mean, I'll blame him.
It's hard to do the morally right thing when you have no power.
Yeah. But I feel like it's easy for me to judge not being in this book. So
yeah.
You know.
So you'll judge.
I'll judge. Now, there's this moment between Kale and Dorian, and it's meant to be a ha ha ha, men are talking type moment, but I don't like it. So, quote, perhaps allowing them, and at this point, Kale and Dorian, like I said, are talking, and they're talking about Nehemia and Selena. Quote, perhaps allowing them to be friends was a horrible, dangerous idea. The captain clapped him on the shoulder. You think that's bad? Then he says something like, you should see him when they really get going. And, you know, we're like, oh my God, that's so funny. Men are bonding. The women are bonding. And it just is like, okay, but women aren't allowed to be friends because now they're teasing him. They're cornering the guys. So then it becomes like women are meant to be controlled. Now people might be rolling their eyes as I say this, saying, you know, they're just being guys. They're just being funny. It's just a funny thing to say. However, you're at the wrong podcast. So you're here to overanalyze. It's men treating women like other. It's always rubbed me the wrong way, even in my everyday life of like, I'm right here, bro. Also, you think it's bad that I'm with this friend and I'm talking shit on it? Like I'm just talking back, just watch me. I will really talk back. So women are still a commodity here and in real life.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we should just start saying, I really don't think I should allow you to be friends with him. Randall, I really don't think I should allow you to be friends with him.
Yeah, I saw this thing on TikTok and it was, you know how they always say, a key that can unlock any lock is a good key, but a bad lock, if, it's just men saying
Yeah.
why men can sleep around and women can't. And this woman was like, a mouth cleaned by many toothbrushes is a clean mouth. A toothbrush that cleans a lot of mouths is a dirty toothbrush.
Oh, I love that.
Isn't that good? A
Yeah.
library that holds many books is knowledgeable. A book that's been to many libraries is tattered.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so good.
Isn't that good?
That's so good.
Yeah. Also, shout out to SJM. She's freaking hilarious. Quote, "This is Dorian. He hadn't meant to annoy her with talk about the dress, though it was outdated, nor had he known she'd be that irritated about not being invited to the feast, but Dorian scowled and walked off to the kennels. Like he's literally a dog walking away with his tail but tucked between his legs. It's just really funny. It's a great visual.
It is a great visual. Now I just see Rowan with his tail in his little butt.
Not the character.
Oh, sorry, not the character, my dog. My dog.
I know.
When we return to Celaena's point of view, she is gleeful at how Nehemia challenges Chaol. And this isn't the first time it's happened, and I'm sure it won't be the last. I feel like Celaena gets a lot of joy out of watching women challenge and annoy men, and that in some ways she feels vicarious power. It's almost as if she's doing it, but she's not, right? And she enjoys that struggle.
I love seeing men picked on.
Yeah, it's true.
Brings great joy.
I think that must be feminine joy. That's one version of feminine joy. I also think she gets joy out of it because she's seeing authorities of Adarlan threatened, right? Anytime Chaol is badgered, anytime Dorian is put down, it's joyful because essentially it's sticking it to the man, right?
Fuck the patriarchy.
Right. Even though these two men are really not the cause of the problem at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But they perpetuate the problem. However, it does go too far when Nehemia rants about the king of Adarlan. Quote, "A shudder went through Celaena and she interrupted before Nehemia could say more." I think this is important because Celaena senses danger towards Nehemia. We as readers know this to be true because of Dorian's point of view. But Celaena's never been told anything to suspect that ill intent towards Nehemia. But in a world where women are othered, are treated violently, and where Nehemia's people, the Ilwe people, are put into Endovir, I mean, it's common sense, but we can't forget that, and Celaena doesn't either.
Mm-hmm. In this moment with Nehemia and Celaena, we see that there's a lot of power in words. And earlier in this book, SJM made a point to say that libraries were the most dangerous places because of ideas. Libraries, books, words. Very powerful. So then you have this quote, "Your king might not be fully versed in their language, but she was smart enough to know the power of saying those two words, your king, not hers." Nehemia in this moment, because she's talking to Chaol and she says something about like, well, you're king. She knows what she's doing. There might be a language barrier, but she can clearly use language as a weapon. And then, while they're all walking, Chaol and Celaena still have this moment. I know how things end. We're only going up to book 3. I know how things end there. I know how it works out. But I still am getting butterflies and kicking my feet, giggling for all these moments. So, quote, "She shrugged, not quite understanding the gleam in his eyes. You told me." Oh, so at this moment, Chaol, like, she says something about like Chaol's brother's name, and Chaol's like, "Oh my God, you remember my brother's name? We're meant to be." And Celaena says, quote, "She shrugged, not quite understanding the gleam in his eyes. You told me. Why wouldn't I remember it? He looked handsome today. It was in the way his hair met his golden skin, in the tiny gaps between the strands, in the way it fell across his brow." I'd be screwed because I wouldn't remember anyone's name. I'd be like, "Your brother, Joe Schmo, right?" And it's because in this moment she's considering his feelings and, the name of his family, and he's finding it like attention is being paid to Chaol, and his best friend is the prince. Guaranteed attention is paid more to Dorian than to Chaol, and now it's on him. So of course he's feeling extra flattered by this. I also want to note the golden skin. As we've kind of talked about, sunshine, gold, rays of gold, light. It's been depicted in moments that's not necessarily good, highlighting we talked about the gold or the sunlight highlighting the blood from one of the champions. So just flagging these things because we're going to see later on in this section, in this episode, how much moonlight represents truth and good and purity. Chaol and Celaena have this adorable moment. Quote, as my friend, you should either bring me along or keep me company. This is Celaena talking about, like, being left behind. Friend, he asks. She blushed. Well, scowling escort is a better description, or reluctant acquaintance if you prefer. To her surprise, he smiled. For me, it's bring me food. I'm offended. Even when Amy has gone to like work dinners and I'm seeing you after, I'm always like, what leftovers can you bring me? Bring food. That's the obvious answer. He does better than that, though. SJM loves to try to get her characters to be friends first before bringing them together. It's very annoying because sometimes it's like, but we were friends. I'm like, you were never friends. You were interested in each other. If you wanted to bone them from the get-go, you were not friends. Although, because they're already, like, these two are already romantically kind of interested. There's that attraction there. That being said, they're finding their peace and their quote unquote friendship in this process. I also didn't realize how much progress was made in this book in their dynamic. I remember the first time I read this, I was so hyper focused on Dorian, and because she's the one who says outright, I want to kiss him. He looks so good. Oh, he's dancing with that idiot blonde. And that's the one who, and I was like, oh, hot prince, of course that's the one she's going to be with. And I remember being kind of thrown and upset in the second book where I was like, Chaol, it's not what I signed up for. But, when you're reading this and you don't trust Celaena, to Celaena to be honest with herself, and you know that she's not honest with herself, all the times that she says that she wants to kiss Dorian are such red herrings. It's such her not wanting to pay attention to this relationship with Chaol that's actually growing.
Yeah, I think in her mind, because she spends more time with Chaol, it's easier to see him as a jailer than it is to see Dorian as a jailer. Dorian's just this figment that's off somewhere else. Chaol's the one that pushes her and forces her body to perform to a certain level.
Yep.
So it's easy for Celaena then to displace her desire to kiss Chaol onto Dorian, because it makes more mental sense to want to kiss Dorian, who's done nothing bad to her body.
Which is confusing because I could easily imagine me kissing someone who has me locked up in handcuffs.
To your earlier point, I completely agree. This is not a love triangle. This is a growing attraction between two individuals and a jealous friend.
Yep.
Saying, no, that's my shiny toy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was no actual love triangle happening. Now, in this moment, I even want to say he was like, might have messed with her hair or something like in that. Like, there's definitely this romantic, intimate moment, we'll say, between the two. And then in that exact moment, Celaena gets emotionally, romantically cockblocked by Nehemia. Quote, the princess grabbed Celaena's hand. You'll teach me, she said in Eelway. Teach me how to better speak your language. Teach me how to write and read it better than I do now. I don't like it. I'm not a fan. I don't like it. It's, you're not being a real friend. And I do think Nehemia does this on purpose. I think that Nehemia is trying to keep that line between you're my ally, he's the enemy. I think there's that moment of we're getting actual kind of conflict between Nehemia in this section, especially as Nehemia gets weird about the word marks, because they're going to see Cain crouching in the dirt, and we'll go to that in the breadcrumbs. And he's like, no one's really like as concerned as they should be. Like, if I saw someone crouching in the dirt, I'd definitely be a lot more fascinated of like, what the hell are they doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Nehemia, though, talks about the word marks and says that they're part of an ancient religion, coming back to the theme of religion, telling Celaena to leave it alone. And when Celaena denies knowing anything about it, Nehemia says, quote, you're hiding something, the princess said softly in Eelway, though it was not accusatory. You are much more than you seem, Lillian. And like, I know Celaena marks it as not accusatory. I know Celaena doesn't see it as a threat. It's hard as a reader to not see it as a threat, but that's just SJM doing a good job with us questioning everyone around her.
I agree with your earlier point that Nehemia is intentionally trying to keep Celaena away from Chaol. And I think that Chaol sees it too.
Mhm.
and he sees it in a way that is going to impact the way he interacts with Nehemia in the future. So that's my first thought. My second thought is the fact that when you look at the number of pages each character spends, when you look at the number of pages Kale versus Dorian versus Nehemia are on the page interacting with Selena, I would probably rank it Kale, Dorian, Nehemia. And maybe off screen that's not the case, but on screen it certainly is. And I'm inclined to believe or trust Nehemia the least, at least with Kale and Dorian, whose perspectives we get. There is more honesty between and vulnerability between them and Selena. Nehemia is not vulnerable, forthcoming, and in this moment, Nehemia doesn't necessarily trust Selena, but you know what? Nehemia hasn't given Selena a real reason to trust her.
Yeah.
And so whether or not she views it as accusatory, it's also for me a projection of, well, I think the same thing about you.
Yep. Yep. I agree. So now we're going to go into chapter 24, and there's a lot of imagery we've seen so far, and as has with the sun related and the moon and the sun and rays of sun, all of that stuff, right? So let's get into moon. Quote, Selena lay on the bed, staring at the pool of moonlight on the floor. It fitted in the dusty gaps between the stone tiles and turned everything in a bluish silver that made her feel as if she were frozen in an everlasting moment. Moonlight it illuminates the dark, it's going to illuminate the lies, it's going to illuminate the truth. The sun can, if you think about it, can be blinding, right? It keeps you from seeing the actual truth, keeps you from seeing anything that's actually happening. Selena will think about the dark as something that is normally fear. Now, this is about she opens the door and she's like, you know what? I see a tunnel. I want to go in that tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
I would never. And so she states that she normally doesn't fear the dark because that's where she works the most in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where she is probably the most comfortable. Instead, she considers the dark as, quote, the time when the stars emerged with glittering beauty and made her feel wonderfully small and insignificant. And that's because of, the night and the stars. And when you look at the planets and everything and you feel insignificant, it puts things into perspective. It's calming, especially when you have someone like Selena whose entire life has blown up and, there's so much drama surrounding her. And there's something comforting knowing that she is just a speck in this grander universe.
I think that this moment's really important for readers to really lean into because we've seen so much of Selena's arrogance, her pride, her self-aggrandizing nature, that it feels incongruent with her character for her to be like, I feel wonderfully small and insignificant when I look at the stars.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something you would expect a prideful person to say. And I think it's just a reminder of how her arrogance is a facade and that she's actually deeply complex in ways that we're not yet familiar with. Now, I understand how Selena's feeling, laying on the bed, looking at the moonlight, feeling dejected. And we see that in her lack of motivation right now. Quote, her eyes were too heavy to read. She wouldn't play the pianoforte for fear of another embarrassing encounter, and she most certainly wouldn't amuse herself with fantasies of what the feast was like. Now, Selena loves these three things: reading, playing the piano, eating, or thinking of food. Food especially.
I relate to her so much.
I do too.
Replace pianoforte with Taylor Swift. Sorry, continue.
It's equivalent. It's fine. Selena is unable to find joy in the things that normally bring her joy because ultimately she doesn't like being left out. She is cut off and she is being left out. And that is so detrimental to her that she cuts herself off from the things that give her power: the reading, the piano, the eating, or thinking about eating in this case. And I think that says a lot about how hurt she is, even if she won't necessarily vocalize how hurt she is.
She then opens the tapestry, like we were saying, like it goes over, and the tapestry was hiding the door the whole time. Quote, the tapestry was odd, old, and not very carefully preserved. Images of forest animals among drooping trees dotted the large expanse. A woman, the only human in the tapestry, stood near the floor. Now, we're going to find out that this is Elena, who the tapestry is showing. And I also love that the tapestry hasn't been maintained, just like Elena's sarcophagi has not been maintained. And I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
make a point about how women are forgotten in history. And
Mm-hmm.
this also shows that we'll know that this is actually her ancestor. And I think that we're going to get this reflection of this is her ancestor. We don't know this at this point, but there's going to be an element of seeing herself in there, or at the very least, aspiring to be that free.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think it surprises anyone that Selena is like, ooh, hidden passages, a secret door. I must go explore, because she's got nothing better to do. Everyone's left her alone and to her own devices. Is it right to go explore these hidden passages? From Kale's perspective, no. But what does she care? She's been forgotten. However, before she goes too far, she prepares to explore like the smart assassin that she is. Note that when she grabs yarn to track her path, she knots it 5 times to the back of a chair. And it's very specific how it's like she knotted it 5 times. Why? So I had to look up numerology, because why not? In numerology, the number 5 represents freedom, adventure, and independence. Those are the things that Selena begins to experience in this chapter. You know, she's not completely free, she's not completely independent, but they are within her grasp.
Yep. Yep. I just love that she's so cool and knows how to prepare. Like, I never would have thought about the yarn. If I were to have gone in there, I'd be like, well, all right, this is the path I'm going. I'll make my way back up. Like,
Yeah, I'll find
how,
it.
yeah, how windy can it really be? And then
Yeah.
she like brings yarn, she brings everything. She brings like a whole ass pack. She's cool. Now she goes into the tunnel. Quote, she tensed as she stepped down, waiting for a single sound that would send her springing back to her rooms. It was silent. Silent and dead and completely forgotten. I'm going to say that her descent into this is going to be a descent into her religious experience. Again, religion means different for different characters. This isn't going to be an actual practicing religion. This is going to be her celebrating her ancestors and finding that spirituality. She didn't go to temple, but she will go to this. And the silence is both threatening and comforting, which is, I'm like, okay, just like the truth and darkness, there's a lot of things happening.
Yeah, there is. As Selena travels through the passages, she senses increasing moisture, which she follows to its source. Quote, Selena chose to go straight, following the moisture that grew by the inch. Water trickled down the walls. She would have considered turning back were it not for the sound that arose. It was running water, slow moving. In fact, as she walked, the passage became lighter. It was not the light of a candle, but rather the smooth, white light of the outdoors, of the moon.
The moon, we're coming back to it. The moon is lighting her path. Also, like I said, her red shoes. And so we have this moment where her red shoes is becoming more flimsy as she's going through the water, the wetness, the truth. She is being bathed. It is almost like a baptism of sorts. I just came up with that one. It reminds me of some of the other times we get like this watering, bathing experience. You talk about, I think in a lot of religions, you kind of get representation of feet, and her feet are being cleansed. These red shoes are being cleansed by this moonlit water.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I am going to go out on a limb and suggest that Selena's blue-green gown is also connected to all of this. Remember, there were descriptions of it flowing like water. I recognize part of the significance of the gown is its age, which, on one hand makes her out of fashion with the court, which makes her a symbol of rebellion for Dorian, but I also think is also meant to further connect her to Elena, her ancestor, that she maybe looks more like Elena and is better able to access her. I also think water in and of itself is is significant in several ways. Jac mentioned baptism, which is definitely something we talk a lot about in SJM works. Water is also associated with life and with nature, and I think in this scene, freedom. It's the presence of water that leads Celaena to the forgotten stream under the castle, and which ultimately leads to a forgotten getaway, a forgotten way to escape the castle. Just the knowledge of that is liberating for Celaena. Quote, "It would be so easy to raise the gate. She felt reckless and wild. What was she doing in the palace? Why was she, Aderlin's assassin, participating in some absurd competition to prove that she was the best? She was the best." Just knowledge of the stream and the exit it leads to are enough to restore Celaena's confidence that she's been lacking over the last few chapters. So I don't think it's coincidence that this is all happening while Celaena is wearing this particular dress. As Jac has said, water, if we see water as a symbol for truth, Celaena is uncovering truth while layered in this symbol of water, that which is very baptismal, right? And as you were saying, the water washing her, soaking her red shoes, washing away, you could see that as like washing away sins almost. Her feet are being baptized. It's like the past 10 years of her life and the experiences she's had, she's being cleansed from them, so that she is prepared for the encounter she's about to have with Elena.
What I also freaking love about this and like the path and everything, because, she finds this potential escape route, but it's water that's going through there. But what is different with this water? The waste is going through this water. She makes a note of how the smell and that there's a waste. So this is not the cleansing, purifying water. And I think that her coming to this point where she's like, I can get out. I'm the best. I'm the best. I'm the best. That is her pride and her ego coming on. I feel like you can almost say that this is a test of her own self. Also, like kind of, again, that religious spiritual test, because she needs to be tested and cleansed before meeting with this ancestor, this higher being. And in order to be shown worthy of this, if she wanted to, she could have gone out into the night. She could have gone and run away. Instead, she chooses to stay. And we'll get into that reason in a moment of why she stays. But just note that although that's water that would get her to freedom, it's tainted water. So in this moment, though, quote, her yarn ran out and she left it on the ground. There was no more turns or marks. I can't remember if it was in this exact moment or a little bit ahead, but at one point that does happen. And I do want to say that it leans more into evidence of this idea of moving on faith. The yarn has run out. She's surrendering to what's going on here. She's going to have faith to make her way back out.
That's a great image, a great symbol. And I appreciate you reminding us of the wastewater, because I forgot. But I think it actually lends itself really well to the point I'm about to make, which is, despite how badly Celaena wants to flee the castle, she ultimately doesn't give in to the temptation. So that exit way through the wastewater, it is a symbol of temptation. And she doesn't give in despite the surge of pride that she feels. And what's her reason? So her reasoning to herself is, quote, "The king would find her somehow, and Chaol would be disgraced and relieved of his position, and Princess Nehemia would be left alone with moronic company. And, well, she would not run from them as a common criminal. She would face them, face the king, and earn her freedom the honorable way. And why not take advantage of the free food and training for a while longer? Not to mention she needed to stock up on provisions for her escape, and that could take weeks. Why rush any of it?" I think there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, Chaol and Nehemia are important in that order. There is, and it's especially poignant that it's Chaol first, right? Chaol would be disgraced, which tells us how much she cares about Chaol and his position. There is absolutely no mention of Dorian. He is the red herring love interest in this book. But despite being able to resist the temptation, her pride still comes into play. It is her pride that makes her stay and be, quote unquote, honorable. I think what's important here is the fact that her reasoning ends with take advantage of free food and training.
All of this is happening, just as a reminder, under the moonlight. Cleansing, purifying, truth, everything. Her honor, even though she wants to joke around with the food and the training and everything, and there's valid reasons as to why she shouldn't run away right now. But like Amy pointed out, her reasoning, Kale, Nehemia, there is honor to her not wanting to run away. And all of this is happening under the moonlight.
Yeah, I love that point. I think it's also important that we focus on this idea that A, the king would find her. That's her first reason. And B, take advantage of free food and training. Celaena is not at full strength. We all know this. We are all constantly being reminded. Even if she wanted to leave and stay gone, she would have to be in prime condition to make that happen. So while she's saying, and she's making us believe, oh, she's taking advantage by staying. And in reality, I do think she is hiding her weakness. Even though she might not, as an unreliable narrator, she might not be honest with us, I do think she is internally honest with herself that I do need food. I do need provisions. She does. And I can guarantee she doesn't even know where she would go if she had freedom. Would she have allies to protect her? So ultimately, Celaena's going to stay. She gets bonus points for not hurting, Kale's reputation. She gets bonus points for being friends with Nehemia and staying. I really think that if she were at full strength, she'd leave and then find a way to take Nehemia with her or apologize to Kale or something. So after she decides to not escape, Celaena returns to the passages and she finds another route that allows her to spy on the festivities in the Great Hall.
And when she sees, when she's lurking in the corners watching the Great Hall, she sees, quote, Kale sitting behind some old man talking and laughing. His happiness made her own face flush in response, and Celaena set down her candle. She's interested in him. It's cute, but she's also distracting herself from her emotions. She gets flushed at his own joy, the fact that he's laughing and everything. And there's a lot more emotions than when she looks at Dorian.
So true. After she sees Kale, this is when Celaena realizes that all the other champions are also there at the feast. Quote, the other champions were allowed to attend and she wasn't. Even the pimply-faced Peller sat near Kale. A half-right boy assassin. She bared her teeth. How dare she be denied an invitation to the feast? The tightness in her chest abated only slightly when she couldn't find Kane's face among the revelers. At least they kept him locked up in a cage too. Celaena equates her situation and Kane's situation to being locked up in a cage like animals, as if they are the only real threats.
She's not wrong.
She's not wrong to be upset about this.
I would be pissed off too. I would not handle it well. I would be. And the thing is, she can't even pretend like she knows either.
Yeah, Yep, she can't.
Celaena then observes Dorian, quote, she spotted the crown prince dancing and laughing with some blonde idiot. She wanted to hate him for refusing to invite her. She was his champion after all, but she had difficulty not staring at him. She had no desire to talk to him, but rather just to look at him, to see what unusual grace and the kindness in his eyes that made her tell him about Sam. While he might be a Havillard.
I think it's Havillard.
Yeah. Well, he might be a Havillard. She very much wanted to kiss him. It just, when you have this idea and understanding that, her and Kale are the ones who are going to get together, this does feel very red herring-ish, she's looking at a hot guy is basically what she said. He's hot. He had kind eyes. There we go. I guess I'll kiss him, compared to Kale when there's a lot more emotions happening there.
Also want to point out, women shouldn't pit themselves against each other. She calls the woman with Dorian some blonde idiot.
Yeah.
Celaena is blonde.
And honestly, sometimes she's an idiot.
Yeah.
At one point, she puts Countdown Caltaine too, where I was and I couldn't even bother to mention it because I was just Celaena, what the okay, we'll come back.
Yeah. We switch to Dorian's point of view, and he has been partying. Oh, I should also mention Celaena sees Kale leave the Great Hall, and so she's like, oh crap, what if he's coming to see me? So she sprints to her room. At this point, we switch to Dorian's point of view, and he's been partying. Quote, his head spun from the wine, and he was so tired from all the dancing that he was fairly certain that if he sat down, he'd fall asleep. We're reminded of how young and naive Dorian is. He has no sense of danger and doesn't feel the need to have his wits about him because he's comfortable relying on Cale. Even though they all know champions are being killed within the castle, it's fine for him to get drunk and fall
Stumbling
asleep.
around and just kind of go into it. Yeah, I want to read the quote that leads up to that quote. After hours of enjoying himself at the feast, Dorian entered Celaena's rooms, not sure what exactly he was doing in the chambers of an assassin at 2 a.m, his head spun from wine. He is like, that's like, what are you doing? It is the equivalent of a, hey, you up text, except it's in person and you're drunk and you're going into her room. That's such an invasion of privacy. Also, I would hate waking up in the middle of the night to a drunk man in my room. Let's just put that into context. It doesn't matter that they had a talk. It doesn't matter that she could kick his ass. He is still a drunk man in a woman's room in the middle of the night.
Without being invited.
Unacceptable.
Yep.
So when he walks into Celaena's room while she's asleep, he does note that she's laying on a red blanket. And like we said, red is evil. Red is Adarlan, Dorian's kingdom. And he likes that she's on the red blanket. Quote, Dorian thinks to himself, though she was asleep on the bed, she still wore that strange dress. Somehow it seemed far more fitting now that she lay sprawled upon the red blanket. There's something very sexual about, again, people are like, God, Jack, you're always back to sex. But however, she's sprawled on a red blanket. I'm saying that like, come on, guys. We all know that's the sexiest way to be sprawled upon a red blanket. But, you know, we have to keep in mind that sex and red are usually intertwined like that. And like the term sprawled is also like a very, you know, sexy word too.
And in Jack's defense, that was also my note. So I see it too.
Yeah. It's a sexy sprawl.
It is a sexy sprawl. Now, when Dorian is looking at Celaena, his drunk mind is trying to rationalize his attraction to her. He knows she's an assassin, but in this moment, he feels no intimidation. I wonder why. Maybe because she's asleep. Quote, he knew her.
Sorry, that's just really funny. He's not intimidated by her at all, by her unconscious body. Good note. Continue.
Thank you. Quote, he knew her somehow, and he knew she wouldn't harm him. It made little sense. When they talked, as sharp as her words usually were, he felt at ease, as if he could say anything. Now, I do think this is SJM doing some good work misguiding us, maybe leading us down a garden path to believe that maybe they have some bond, some sort of connection. But really what this is Dorian sees someone who he thinks is like him, right? Even though their experiences are very different, there are similarities. So he's like, oh, we're connected. We've experienced the same things. I also think, you know, inebriated Dorian does not have good judgment. And he is like prey being fooled by the predator. And I'm going to say in this instant that Celaena is the predator and Dorian's the prey, even though he's acting like the predator right now.
Yeah. Agreed. No, I'm like, yeah. No, I'm like, oh, yeah. Agreed. No. There's no correction. I'm like, yeah, you're right.
Ultimately, though, if we go back to the red blanket, I think what this really gets to is this idea of Dorian needing to rebel and needing to possess Celaena to feel rebellious. And so by needing to possess Celaena, he's putting on blinders to the reality of who she is. It is therefore unsurprising when he discovers Cale is already in Celaena's room.
What are these men doing in her room? What are these men just hanging out, having a party in there?
Yeah. It's not surprising then that there's jealousy on Dorian's part because his opportunity to possess, to achieve rebellion is denied. And quote, Dorian, for some reason, didn't sleep well that night.
Yep. I want to go into my point of view of that section. Quote, when they talked as sharp as so this is Dorian reflecting on his conversation with Celaena. When they talked, as sharp as her words usually were, he felt at ease, as if he could say anything. She must have felt the same after she told him about Sam, whoever he'd been. So here he was, in the middle of the night. She flirted with him, but was it real? I was like, are they having the same conversation? Did they have the same conversation? Now, granted, Selena says his eyes were kind and that's why she told him about Sam.
Mm-hmm.
I question if Selena was even having the same conversation that we read.
Yeah.
She was really exasperated with him and then told him. I don't and he also wasn't kind. He was a douchebag the entire
Mm-hmm.
time. Then he was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh man, I feel bad now." So, there's a definite distortion of like what actually happened in that conversation. And the fact that she was so defeated when she told him about Sam, it wasn't a moment of necessarily connection. She was really defeated. And then he kind of goes like, so that's why she was here because that's why he's there in her room because she flirted with him. Like you go from, she told me about Sam, we flirted, I'm in her room. I don't know what more she wants from me. I'm doing all the things that she's clearly wanting me to do. Amy's covering her mouth just with pure frustration.
Not to bring up painful memories.
Okay.
But we know people who are like this, who take advantage of vulnerable women. Or we used to know people who have acted like this. Let me finish what I'm saying.
Okay.
Takes advantage of vulnerable women who might emotionally be vulnerable or physically be vulnerable because they're drinking and be like, you know what? They flirted with me. I'm allowed to be here. I'm
Yeah.
allowed to do things.
Yep.
No. No.
No,
This is
no.
unacceptable.
Oh shit, I know who you're talking about. You're talking about
I didn't want to say the name.
I'll bleep it. Is that his name?
Yeah.
Okay.
This moment makes me think of
That is 100%. And I'll say it. Like I'm fine. I'll be honest with it. I was 100% emotionally manipulated into an intimate moment with a guy. Like just taking advantage of vulnerability and oh my god, I forgot his name. Oh shit.
I mean, when I was like this,
Yeah.
covering my mouth, that's when it dawned on me. I was like, oh.
Little did he know I'm an assassin too. Yeah. You're fucking right. Uh Ew. Gives me an extra nasty taste in my mouth now.
Yeah. I mean, it's bad, Dorian. Which, A, this is why Selena and Dorian will never work out.
Yeah.
B, why when Dorian does fall in love, it's so poignant. And C, the rest of his journey and who he becomes is so different.
Yeah.
From this Dorian.
Yep. Absolutely.
This is a misguided, entitled boy.
And they become friends and they're tight.
Yes.
And that's where they belong. And that's absolutely where they belong.
Yeah.
But at this moment, Kale comes in and kicks him out. And I love it. I love Kale kicking him out. I love a protectiveness there.
I want to clarify. Kale's already in the room.
Yeah, it doesn't matter that he's in the room. He's not drunk. He's there to give her a present. Although we don't know how long he's been there.
Yeah.
It's fine.
It's just okay.
Edward from Twilight trained me. It's okay to watch someone while they're sleeping. It's okay. That's not creepy at all. But he comes in, right? He kicks him out. And now we're in Kale's point of view. Quote, he didn't understand the rage that arose upon seeing Dorian standing in the doorway. Didn't want to understand that sort of anger. It wasn't jealousy, but something beyond it. Something that transformed his friend into something else. Someone he didn't know. He was fairly certain she was a virgin. But did Dorian know it? We kind of talked about it. Like what are the clues? She's actually pretty like overt with her sexuality and her body. And I feel like there's no clues about her being a virgin at this point. However, he's also not wrong, but weird thing to point out there. And also weird thing that he finds comfort in because knowing that Dorian isn't a true threat because she's still a virgin.
That's a really, really good point. I saw it from a different perspective. I saw it as Kale starting to villainize his best friend.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Which shows you how Kale feels about Selena, but also is not going to be good for their relationship in the long term.
Yeah. Again, meanwhile, she's just asleep. I'd be snoring. I snore. You can't have this romantic moment. It's not romantic. It's creepy predatory. Damn it, Jack. Train my brain. It's not Robert Pattinson.
No, it's not. And also, I know she acts like she's asleep, but she just came from the passages And Dorian remarks how her face is like pink, like she's pretending to be asleep.
Okay. I didn't realize that. I was like, oh no, she fell asleep really quickly. It's been hours. It makes sense though, because for whatever reason, I was like, oh yeah, she's asleep. So what? Like it took him a couple hours to get to her room.
Can I read the part?
Yeah,
Just,
no, go for it.
just to clarify. Okay. Her golden hair was spread around her, and a flush of pink bloomed on her cheeks. A book lay by her side, open and still waiting for her to turn the page. She wasn't reading before this. She had no motivation to read. She's pretending to be asleep.
She's better than me. She's better than me. I love her. I love it that she's like listening to these guys argue and she's like, what the fuck?
Now we're in Kale's point of view. Dorian has left, and it is amazing how differently Kale views Selena as she sleeps compared to Dorian. I just happened to read what Dorian was, seeing and what he thought. He was like, oh, I know her. She's not dangerous. So this is Kale's point of view. Quote, she was still in her clothes, and while she looked beautiful, that did nothing to mask the killing potential that lay beneath. It was present in her strong jaw, in the slope of her eyebrows, in the perfect stillness of her form. She was a honed blade made by the king of assassins for his own profit. She was a sleeping animal, a mountain cat or a dragon, and her markings of power were everywhere. I get chills from that description because on one hand, yes, she is very powerful, but she's not the most powerful she's ever been. Now, Kale, having spent more time with Selena than Dorian, sees what Dorian can't in Selena, but I also think his capacity to always see threats makes his view of Selena biased. So we're getting these two extreme viewpoints of Selena, and I don't think either is necessarily the objective truth. I think both are colored by bias.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're both misappropriating her power and where her power lies.
Yeah. I mean, he views her as a cat and a dragon, deadly and mythical. Like she's not even real. She's an animal. She's a mythical dragon. Like those are.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because for Kale to view Selena as a dragon, and a dragon is a mythical being, and he's a very by the book black and white person, that in and of itself signals how much more power he's giving Selena than she's actually capable of, which, becomes apparent in later in this episode. So he is putting her on a pedestal that is not a pedestal he wants her on, and she doesn't necessarily want to be on.
Yeah. Okay, I want you to scroll down until you're past my notes. Get into chapter 25 notes.
Okay.
Don't look at this.
Not looking.
Good. So everyone's about to hate me is the beginning of my next note. Kale gives Selena a silver ring, right? He goes around and they're handing out party favors to everyone, and all the noble women get it. And he goes out of his way to get her this ring, even though he tells her to steal one, even though he tells her like, it's no big deal. They're just handing them out. It's sweet. It's a good, real cute little thing here he's giving her. And, there's this idea and almost imagery of a proposal, but I'm going to argue that it's not a sign of a proposal. I want to take it one step farther. I want to remind everyone that he is the replacement of Arobin, almost a father figure. Dare I say, a purity ring. Amy's face. Because what did we know about his assumptions and guessing? Was her virginity.
Yes.
And that, it is something that he has to kick Dorian out of the room for. It is something to be protected. It is something, dare we say, is his. It is a moment to give upon her. It is a purity ring that he has given her.
A chastity belt.
Chastity belt, essentially. Here's the moment. Quote, then she was asleep, a hand upon her breast, the ring hovering over her heart. It's very Sleeping Beauty. It's very princess-like. It's the way that he views her. She's this damsel just sleeping with her hand upon her heart, and that the ring that he gave her is on her heart. It's a purity ring, guys. It's a
if not a purity ring, a promise ring.
Promise ring, but there's that father element that we've talked about.
Yeah.
There. I know. Now we're back for chapter 25, and this starts with Selena in a dream, because we just keep having her be in dreams, although this is not really a dream. Coming back to this whole foreshadowing that we've been talking about, quote, and the smell, it wasn't the smell of mildew, but of roses. I just love when SJM keeps bringing it back around.
Mhm.
And while Selena is in the tomb, she starts to really get a bearing and seeing her surroundings. Quote, a shaft of moonlight shot through a small hole in the ceiling, falling upon the face of a beautiful marble statue lying upon a stone slab. No, not a statue, a sarcophagus. It was a tomb. There is no sunlight here. There is moonlight. And like we were saying, it's healing, it's spiritual. This is not a religious experience. This is a spiritual experience.
I love that. And, it's almost like the scent of roses are like incense
Ooh,
at a
yeah.
tomb,
Yeah.
because it always wafts in when Fate, the mother, is trying to lead Selena to the tomb.
Yep.
Now, for whatever reason, Selena thinks that she's dreaming. As Jack said, she is not. But in this supposed dream, it is the tomb of her ancestor, Elena, the first princess of Terrasen, and her husband, Gavin, the first king of Adarlan. So we get a little bit of history here. It has always also bothered me that it's Selena and Elena because they are so similar, and I'm sure that was intentional.
But it's a bad intentional. I don't like it.
It just doesn't work for me. It's very confusing.
It made me confused for a very long time.
Same. Anyway, Selena has a little moment of panic when she realizes she's in this tomb. Quote, she shouldn't have entered the tomb. She shouldn't have strayed into the sacred places of the dead when she was so stained and tainted by her crimes. Something would come after her and haunt her and torture her for disturbing their peace. Now, I think this is a breadcrumb. But we see here again Selena's spirituality, her superstition that informs this moment. I think it's funny because I'm like, oh yeah, Elena is definitely going to haunt you, but not in the way you think. But we've talked about how Selena has kind of gone through this cleansing of her sins. And so even though she views herself as stained and tainted, she may not be in the eyes of Elena, especially when Elena later is going to tell her everything happens for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And everything about this scene in this initial moment, SJM wants us to feel as confused as Selena. And that's really hard because Selena knows more than what the reader knows.
Mhm.
Selena knows that she's Aelin. Selena knows that she's related. However, we can't have Selena be obviously hiding something from us, even though we know she is. So we need to show that she's confused to make us confused. Quote, it was covered in stars, raised carvings that mirrored the night sky, and the ceiling depicted the earth. Why were they reversed? She looked at the walls and put a hand to her heart. Everything here is opposite. It's not what it seems. It is confusing. It's her questioning things. And, we're too busy questioning her questions for us to question herself to her.
Something I realized as we were speaking earlier in the episode, when Selena looks at the stars, she feels small and insignificant. But now she's in the place of stars looking at the earth, looking down at Elena. She and Elena are technically both looking down to the earth, which I think is also supposed to symbolize like Selena, aka Aelin, have a grander purpose. Like you are not as small and insignificant as you think you are. And that's what she's about to kind of uncover. Selena, despite being nervous about being there or confused, can't help but examine the face of the woman on the sarcophagus. Quote, she was beautiful beyond reckoning. Her silver hair flowed around her youthful face like a river of moonlight. We're seeing that water connection again, water and moon connecting Selena to her ancestor, Elena. And, Jack has talked about moonlight being truth, uncovering truth and accessing truth. I also think it's about connecting Elena to her ancestors, right? When she looks at the stars, or when the moon is present, it's also about being connected to the destiny that came before her and the destiny that will come after her.
Mm-hmm. And, have to keep pointing out that moonlight. Elena's hair is coating her face like a river of moonlight.
Mm-hmm.
She is now moonlight, right? Elena is covered in moonlight herself. So we can guess that she is someone who is the embodiment of truth.
Mm-hmm.
of light, of goodness. There's a moment where SJM makes a very important point. Quote, "But why was their tomb so neglected? Why had no one been to honor the dead this day? Why were there not flowers at her head? Why was Elena Galathinius Havillard forgotten?" Ooh, ooh. Not only is this a remark about how women are very often forgotten in history, we are overlooked, we are not given credit, but it's also a note about how Selena herself has been overlooked in history.
Mm.
She is just now a sad footnote into what had happened to Terrorson. SJM, I feel like, did this scene perfectly, and we know that she did because she probably rewrote this a bunch. And everything that is said can be said in two views. You can read something as Selena, and then you can read it again as Aelin, and it works absolutely perfectly. So I'm going to read 2 points that I'm just as an example. So think of this as Selena and then Aelin. Quote, "She shouldn't have strayed into the sacred place of the dead when she was so stained and tainted by her crimes." As Selena, you'd imagine that as she's an assassin, she's stained and tainted by her crimes. As Aelin, you'd imagine it as someone who she feels like she left and abandoned her kingdom. And then this other quote, "Damaris," she whispered, naming the blade, "you know your history." That's such a good one. That's such a good one because that is history. That is the name of the blade. And then at the same time, that's Elena telling Aelin that you know your history, as in your familial history.
That's a really good point. Good
Right?
job. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, holy shit, you're saying like, oh, you know your history, like you yourself, your specific history.
Yeah. 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 Great point.
Now I want to look into this quote. "You must listen to what I tell you. Nothing is coincidence. Everything has a purpose. You were meant to come into this castle just as you were meant to be an assassin, to learn the skills necessary for survival." I think that this is one of those things that people and authors include in books because it resonates with people. Because if our heroine, who has been through absolute shit in life, has gone through these things to get her to where she is now, then we, the readers, can have gone through the same thing. We can also feel like, wow, I went through my horrible stuff because I am here now. And that's what I've landed on type thing. Like, and I'm here because of those lessons. It's just it's a good thing. I love it when authors do that because I personally resonate with that sentiment.
Yeah, I do too. And I think if we look at Elena as the embodiment of truth, this place is a temple. This is the truth of Selena's or Aelin's spirituality, that there are forces at work that ensured you went through these things so that you could overcome future things. And like you, Jac, I resonate with that a lot in my own personal experience. It's not something that Selena's going to have an easy time stomaching, though. That is a really hard thing to hear when you're still in the middle of shit, and it's not going to get easier. So, Selena is having this spiritual experience, but it's not one that is necessarily on her terms. And I think that she's going to have to reckon with that throughout the rest of this book and in the future. But I still love it. And Elena continues, quote, "You were led here tonight, but not by me. I was led here too. Someone wants you to learn. Someone wants you to see." And that brings in a whole other layer of higher power, deity. Who is this entity? We're going to see the effects of this entity throughout the series. And then when that entity is no longer present, I'm really excited to uncover it. I'm really excited for what SJM has built because I think it has repercussions for the rest of the novel and her other works. So I just have to point it out because she put her stake in the ground at the beginning.
This is also such a great example of what a traditional book is. And when we say traditional book, I mean beginning, middle, and act 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4. You have the call to the hero's journey at the beginning. You kind of have the like, okay, here's the initial plot. You're a champion. You have to go through these tests. But a lot of times the greater, more intense plot will come in about midway. And this is almost exactly 50%. It's like at 48 or 46% of the book.
Yeah. What this does is it makes it more than just a competition trope novel.
Yeah.
It gives it higher purpose and it keeps the reader intrigued because we're going to think about this once the competition is over. What does this mean? What does it mean for the future? And
Mhm.
we're going to want to uncover that. And I love that it's planted here
Yes. Yeah.
rather than in the last 3 chapters of the book.
Absolutely. And by this point by the end of this chapter, this episode, you're going to have the challenge that they're going through, the secret murders, and then this, ancestral thing that's happening of like, watch out, there's evil, which is
Mhm.
probably related to the killings, which we can, make that deduction. But it's a good job of like by midway through the book, you have several things that are keeping you, the reader, interested. Just from a writing perspective, I always appreciate that. I love the balance of this chapter because you had the end of last chapter where Selena goes to bed with, the ring that Kale gave her. In this moment, though, she wakes up and she has the amulet that Elena gave her, quote, made of intricate bands of metal. Within the round border of the amulet lay 2 overlapping circles, one on top of the other. In the space that they'd shared was a small blue gem that gave the center of the amulet the appearance of an eye. A line ran straight through the entire thing. Now, while Kale's was a sign of purity and promise, here is the sign of perseverance and promise. It's like, I'm watching you. You got to do your
Mhm.
shit. I'm here to protect you, but you need to keep going. And then the fact that the chapter ends with the smell of roses again, it's that perfect mirroring, right? It's
Yeah.
a multiple arc structure here.
Yeah. I like this point that you bring up about it being mirroring because Kale's promise is I'm watching over you to make sure you don't make bad choices.
Yeah.
Whereas Elena's is I'm watching over you to protect you.
Yep. I love that. I love that. Now, you might be like, hey, that was a really short chapter, especially considering it's been like an hour per chapter we've discussed things. However, there's a lot to have at the breadcrumbs and broomstick section, so stick around. Now we're going into chapter 26. The chapter starts with Selena waking up. Now, the first time Selena woke up from a nightmare, it was from her PTSD trauma. The second time she woke up, it was because she was told to save the world. The third time now confirms that she is in fact safe. However, it's more a physically aggressive way of waking up compared to the other ones, which is saying something because the other one was like she was in a tunnel. So this is where Kale comes in and is kind of freaking out because what we do know is that there's been a murder in the palace. Quote, he put a hand on his sword as he ripped back the blankets and dragged her out of bed by the elbow. Like, just damn.
Yeah. You're going to make a couple arguments about Kale in this chapter, and I'm going to argue the opposite because I think that's how a lot of people don't view this kindly. They don't view Kale kindly. And what we're seeing is that Selena's still in bed. And if anything, she was in danger more than she caused danger to other people. But I think what we're going to see throughout the scene is Kale cares about Selena, but he is always going to be suspicious first, empathetic second.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I like it because you could definitely read this in 2 different ways, and we just
Mm-hmm.
don't know Kale's motives and mindset
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Unlike the other 2 times when Selena woke up, she's a lot more sure of herself. I feel like that's what happens when a ghost tells you have a destiny. Anyway, quote, she refused to step back as he studied her face, then her hands, then the rest of her. As he did so, she returned the favor. They're on equal footing here. Like he's looking her up and down. So it's like, bitch, I'll look you up and down at the same time too. And, like like I said, like, you can say that her ancestors have grounded her to feel that way. It put things in perspective, you know what I mean? When you have a ghost that's been staring at you to then like this random boy. Because Kale is a dumb boy who cannot express his emotions, we get this interaction between the two. Kale doesn't necessarily accuse Selena of having been the person to attack. However, there's no logical reason why it would be Selena because of how the body was found. So you get this quote. And I suppose you think I did it? I hope you didn't, as the body was half eaten. Eaten? She crinkled her nose. Like, I see what you're saying where, like, Kale cannot trust Selena. And I agree. Like, I don't argue that at all. I think there's a lot of complicated emotions within him. And I think both of our things are kind of, can be working in tandem. But there's also this element of like, well, of course she didn't eat this guy. Like, of course that's like, she didn't do it. But I know. So in my perspective, I'm like, I think he's also partly trying to see if she's safe.
Yeah, and I don't deny that. And I don't deny that Kale is a little bit messed up in the head and needs to go to a lot of therapy to figure
Yeah.
out what his priorities are. I do think he wants to make sure she's safe, but I also know that he can't deny the fact that just yesterday
Yeah.
she said to him,
Yep.
I celebrate in my own way.
Yep.
And she mentioned something about giving sacrifices. Like,
Yeah.
this is when we see the body and we see how ritualistic it comes across, um the act of the killing. Kale is doing the right thing by and doing his due diligence by making sure it wasn't Selena. However, it doesn't deny the fact that he keeps asking her even after she has denied it, like, where were you last night? Where were you last night? And she's like, I was here. You locked me up in here. So no matter how much he wants her to be safe, he also doesn't trust her. And that, I think, is ultimately why readers struggle with Kale, because they're like, you should just trust her. Why are you being a dick?
But like, he can't trust her completely.
No, he can't. He
Yeah.
can't. And I'm not saying he
No, I'm
he
talking to
should.
you. I'm talking to them.
Got it. Okay.
The them of the outside.
Let's also take a moment to dig a little into what Kale just said. Quote, I'm hoping you didn't kill the champion as the body was half eaten. This is an illuminating moment because no matter the champion, they are being consumed in some manner by whatever evil is in the castle. Their innards are being taken out, their brain is being taken out, and they're not there. We are being reminded of human weakness. And all these humans that have died are supposed to be capable in some manner, whether they're assassin or from the army, etc. So therefore, by being killed and half eaten, whatever is hunting down the champions, it has greater power than them. We should be afraid for Selena, and Selena should be afraid for herself when she knows that she's not at her 100% strength level or capacity. But Selena writes this off just as much as Dorian and Kale do. When she thinks about the killer, she thinks, quote, some vermin probably got to the body before it was found. Very, very hungry vermin. Now, she's trying to comfort herself. I understand that when she's being dismissive. However, this is the opposite of what I was just saying. She's crediting vermin, like mice and rats, with more power than humans. No. No, Selena. But she needs that reassurance so that she can go about her day, because there's nothing she can do about whatever evil exists.
Maybe she thinks that they're ROUS's, rodents of unusual size. That is a Princess Bride reference.
I haven't watched Princess Bride in a long time.
I love it so much.
Yeah.
Selena then heads back to the tomb after Kale's like, you'll be happy to know you don't get to work. You don't have to do anything today. She's like, great, I'm going to bed. And then the second he walks away, she's like, psych. And then the only thing left she could have done is like put pillows underneath the blankets to be like, he'll never know that I'm not here. So she goes back to the tomb, and we get a clue as to why she won't find anything there. Quote, in the daytime, a ray of sunlight shone into the tomb, making all of the dust motes she stirred up swirl like falling snow. There's sunlight here. And like we were saying, moonlight is what's going to illuminate the truth. This is just highlighting what is cold, snow falling and everything. Also, just kind of, I feel like this is, whether this was done on purpose or not, it reminds me of red shoes, like winter berries poking out in the snow. And here is another moment of out in the sun with snow. Even while Selena is trying to figure out what's going on, she still has a sense of humor. Selena wrapped a finger on the queen's pert nose. And now she's like, so like she's leaning on the sarcophagus. One would think you'd have better things to do with your afterlife, she thought with a tired grin. Her voice came out quieter than she would have liked. Even with her humor back and her trying to like work through things, it's still not entirely working because she's experiencing self-doubt. There's a certain level of imposter syndrome, which is an interesting thing. Of, you know, that God, what's her name? Iona. She's the rugby player that's super popular, very famous female.
I don't remember her name, but I know who you're talking about.
They did
US team.
Yeah. And there was an interview with her recently, and they asked her, how does it feel, like how, how does it feel like to have gone, like, you to have this level of success? Like, how are you dealing with imposter syndrome? And her response is, I don't have imposter syndrome. I've worked really hard to get here. And then it's this like idea of women, oftentimes, I felt it a million times of feeling imposter syndrome. We should have this more like, I don't have imposter syndrome. I worked my ass to get here. That's just a side note. But in this moment, I think she does have imposter syndrome where she was like, me? You want me to do this? All right. And that's why we get the sense of false bravado coming back, because it's easier for her to have that sense of self fake bravado, right? Quote, not that the thought of something wicked dwelling in this castle scared her or anything. No, it wasn't that at all. She's scared, but she won't admit it, understandably.
This honestly sounds like something you would say.
All right. Yes, that's true. It is, in fact, true. What happens when Selena was walking around the day before in an old dress and is questioning her self-worth and is questioning her ability of saving everyone? What, like the day before, she's, going through, like, she just wasn't herself at her maximum ability. So what does she do? She finds and takes control of her looks. And she looks really, really good. We can attest to that because, quote, she smiled at the young Chevaliers. Okay. She smiled at the young.
Technically, it's Chevalier.
Chevaliers. Okay. She smiled at.
I'm just trying to think of what people will be less mad about us saying.
Let me just look at the pronunciation. Chevaliers.
Yeah, okay. Chevalier.
She smiled at the young chevaliers they passed and smirked at the court women who eyed her pink and white gown. She couldn't blame them. The dress was spectacular, and she was spectacular in it. Even Ress, one of the handsomer guards posted outside her rooms, had said so. Naturally, it hadn't been too difficult to convince him to escort her to the library. Like, she knows what she's doing. She's back in full force. And she also knows what she's doing by wearing a pink and white gown. It's very innocent, very sweet and girlish. And she's taking back control with her fashion and using her appearance as a weapon. All the while looking like innocence and purity with her purity ring. So I will forever call it.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And there is power in this disguise, right? There's a murder on the loose. Cale has questioned her about where she was all night and has basically accused her of being a suspect. So by highlighting her innocence, not only is she able to manipulate the guards into helping her get more information, it helps everyone else also continue to associate her with innocence, and therefore she can't be the killer, which, honestly, brilliant. It's a great
100
plan.
Chef's kiss. That's the level of manipulation that we approve of. There's like a thing I saw where it's like millennials just keep making Harry Potter references because that's just like all we are.
Yeah. That was our entire lives.
That being said, she's a Slytherin, not a Gryffindor.
I never suggested otherwise.
In stark contrast of what Selena looks like is the reality of what's around them, which is the death of the champion. Quote, Xavier's chest cavity had been split open and his vital organs removed. Unless someone had moved them upon finding the body, there was no trace of them, and his long face, stripped of its flesh, was still contorted in a silent scream. I don't think I appreciate, like, actually visualized, like, so it's just muscle?
Yeah.
Ew.
Yeah. So let's continue that quote. This was no accidental killing. There was a hole in the crown of Xavier's head, and she could see that his brain was gone too. The smears of blood on the wall looked like someone had been writing and then rubbed it away. But even now, some of the writing remained, and she tried not to gape at it. Word marks, 3 word marks forming an arcing line that had to have once been a circle near the body. Strong witchcraft vibes, very serial killer. It immediately made me think of the Night Stalker.
I was gonna say the Night Stalker too.
If you haven't watched the Netflix documentary and you like true crime, you absolutely must. It is so good. But it like gives me the heebie-jeebies. SJM.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah, it's very terrifying. And I think that it's also, you have this like, here she is with pure innocence and she's looking at this like horrible scene, but rather than being horrified of what she's necessarily looking at, she has a different interpretation of the moment, we'll say. Quote, fool. If she wanted to knock off her competitors one by one, she'd do it quick and clean. A slit throat, a knife in the heart, a poisoned glass of wine. This was just plain tasteless. like she's criticizing the way that it's like the way that they're being killed. And remember, there is pride to her work. Art, death is art, and she takes lives, but she does it with a level of grace and art to her work. And I think it also could be like, what the hell, Kale? You think I'm capable of this? Like, I'm much classier of a murderer.
And this goes back to a conversation we had when they first started training together. Selena knows and is being reminded that Kale doesn't appreciate the craft of an assassin. And I'm going to use air quotes, she quote unquote takes pride in her craft because she has to justify to herself what she's done. She doesn't appreciate what the murder's done because it's senseless, it's basically torture. And she's allowed to poo-poo it because it's not something she's guilty of doing herself. And so she's not horrified because for the first time in a while, she's able to be like, ugh, that's disgusting. That's tacky. That's unacceptable. As if these more humane ways, quote unquote, humane ways of killing with slicing the throat, poison, those things are less involved.
Yeah.
Less that.
It's not torture.
It's not torture the way that this is. I don't know why I was really on something last night because my note says also, no matter what Kale feels towards Selena, he's always mistrust forward. Logic is not available to him when he is in protector mode. Honestly, I'm not surprised Selena isn't more offended. Like, she should be extremely offended that this torture, this way of killing is misappropriated onto her.
Yeah. I agree. She should be insulted of like, you really think that I would be capable of doing this?
Yeah.
This gruesome murder?
And that's, I think, ultimately why at the end of the day, Kale and Selena are not going to work, because he is capable of thinking of the worst, but beyond the worst of people.
I also feel like what we're seeing is a murder. She's not a murderer. Yeah. She's an assassin. And that's why they keep calling her an assassin, because even though she's killed someone, it's not the same. So, there's a difference there.
Yeah, I think so too. At the end of the scene, Selena ultimately ends with empathy for the dead champion, something we saw happen in last week's episode for the other champions who are killed. Quote, she should thank whatever grim god had decided to end Xavier's life, but for some reason, she couldn't. At the end of the day, Selena is an assassin, but she also understands the value of life. She doesn't take death lightly. She doesn't, I'm not going to say that she enjoys the act of killing, because she's had to inflict a lot of death in order to survive over the last decade. So she knows the difference between life and death. And that's why at the end of the day, even though Xavier was competition, she can't be happy that he was killed.
But at the same time, she is thanking whatever grim god did kill him. Like, that's
it. She should thank.
She should thank whatever. Yeah.
But for some reason she couldn't.
Oh,
She doesn't.
Gotcha. Yeah, never mind. We're now in Dorian's POV and the boys are fighting. They're being a little snippy. And the best part of I feel like some of SJM's best writing has been in these middle chapters. Like, I think she's really found her stride as an author here, because one of my favorite parts in this section is that the actions work for what they're actually arguing about. The actions and the emotions of the conversation are playing out. So Dorian is not ready for this fight/conversation. Quote, his muscles were sore from weeks of not practicing. His breath was ragged in his throat as he thrust and thrust again. So he is physically not ready to talk about this, right? His breath is stuck in his throat. His words are stuck in his throat. You can think about it. And he's out of practice when it comes to his emotions, and out of practice when it comes to women, aka Selena. Just as Kale was too physically hard on Selena, he's just as physically hard with Dorian. He is not holding back. He is fighting there. This is me waving a sword. This is sword fighting. Of course, this discussion would only happen, though, with controlled violence, because God forbid they actually share their emotions without sharp weapons.
Right. That's never going to happen. Kale mocks Dorian through all of this also, which is not good. Quote, This is what comes from such idle behavior, Cale chuckled, stepping to the side so that Dorian stumbled forward. He remembered a time when they'd been of equal skill, though that had been long ago. Dorian, while he still enjoyed swordplay, had grown to prefer books. Now, what if we take the symbolic nature of this conversation, what we're really getting at is the emotional the capacity for emotional intimacy, right? Dorian being in court, being under the thumb of his father and his mother, is unable to engage in meaningful conversation or relationships with people around him other than Cale. Cale's the opposite, right? He has relationships with his guards. He's able to form a new relationship with Celaena. And Dorian's getting his ass whooped.
Yeah.
He is a soft boy. And Cale's mocking him right now, but unfortunately it's true, and Dorian will be ripped apart and rebuilt anew because of his inability to really connect with people. And yeah, I'll let you continue because this goes on throughout the entire scene.
I really like this scene, and kind of coming back to what I was saying about how the actions of the fight mimic their conversation. Quote, "At least one of you has some common sense." Cale delivered each blow with such precision that Dorian had to admire him, "because you've clearly lost your mind." Again, each blow, they're talking about sword fighting, but what he's saying is also a blow to Dorian. Then Dorian says, "And what about you?" Dorian demanded. "Do you want me to comment on how you showed up in her rooms last night, the same night another champion died?" Dorian fainted, but Cale didn't fall for it. Now, again, the physical actions are he fainted and he didn't fall for it sword-wise, but he also fainted by trying to provoke him, but Cale doesn't fall for the provocation. He doesn't take the bait.
It's so good. It's so good.
It's so good.
And I think, I don't know if it's clear or if you said it in your notes, Jac, but it's clear that even though they're sparring in a practicing sort of way, they're really verbally and physically sparring over Celaena.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's what.
Is that your note at the end?
No, it was like, I thought that I already said that, where it's like they're talking, it's implied they're talking about Celaena, but it's like they're physically fighting and they're verbally fighting at the same time. It's matching.
I'm sorry, I missed my brain.
I was like, that's what I've been talking about for minutes.
No, I just couldn't remember if you explicitly stated Celaena.
Well, I mean, okay, so I may not have explicitly said, but this is about Celaena. They are talking about her. Dorian knows that Cale is there for him. However, even though they're talking, they're fighting over a girl here, Dorian knows that Cale is there for him, being a friend first. Quote, "Taking the time to spar with him when there was a fresh corpse in the castle was a sacrifice Dorian was surprised Cale had been willing to make. Dorian knew how much his position meant to him." As I'm about to say something, I'm already like fighting it in my head. So at first I was like, wow, this is important to show that the Cale is willing to show that he puts the people he loves first, right? To talk to Dorian, to be there for him. At first I was like, yeah, like Cale is just trying to, be there as a good friend. And now I'm like, no, Cale is taking time out of his day to go and just tell his friend, like, back the fuck up. Do not mess with her. All right, so that kind of changes some. Either way, Cale's willing to put his issues aside for something.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point because we saw how Cale was villainizing Dorian in the previous chapter of like, doesn't Dorian know she's a virgin? Right?
Yeah.
Accusing him of being a fuckboy. Here, Dorian is doing the opposite. He's like, wow, I'm really grateful that my friend is taking the time to spend time with me.
Yeah.
And so we see how much more interested and territorial maybe Cale is over Celaena than Dorian is. But also, again, even with people he truly loves, Cale will think the worst of people around him first before he is capable of thinking of the good.
Yeah.
Which
is Dorian, one of his downfalls.
It is. And that's and it's important that we see that Dorian is not exempt from that.
Yeah. Equal opportunity.
Yeah.
In contrast to Cale being a good friend, Dorian can't not think about himself. However, I was about to say, like, I'm changing my note. Maybe Cale isn't being a good friend. He's there to scold him. However, Dorian also cannot not think about himself. Quote, "There was something so defeated, so bitter, underlining the captain's words that Dorian, for a heartbeat, felt badly. he should stay away from Selena. Kale had enough to worry about. But then he thought about the list his mother made and he realized he'd had enough too. Dude, like, what the fuck? Like, that's, as much as Kale sucks for, not expecting the best out of his friends, out of everyone.
Yeah.
Of course, he's not wrong. That's the thing, where his best friend, he's not expecting the best out of Dorian, but Dorian is literally saying, oh, my mommy wants me to date a woman or marry a woman from this list. I'm going to go hit on this girl that my friend likes. And then, to Kale's point, Selena is an assassin who's doing things behind his back. So even though it's one of Kale's downfalls, he's also not wrong.
Correct. It's just not a great situation. And also, they're 18, 19, and 22. So
no,
they're all going to be a little immature.
They're all 20 years older. Because as I said, I couldn't handle 10 years wasn't enough.
Maybe 15.
15 years.
So right before the quote that Jac read, there's this moment where Dorian and Kale talk about the guards at Selena's door. Quote, Dorian's blood went a bit cold. You think they'll try to kill Selena? Kale, I added some extra guards around her rooms. Dorian, to protect her or to keep her in? They stopped at the hallway crossroads where they would part ways to their separate rooms. What difference does it make? Kale said quietly. You don't seem to care either way. You'll visit her no matter what I say, and the guards won't stop you because you're the prince.
Some anger here.
Yeah.
Resentment.
Now, Dorian's calling Kale out for kind of that mistrust of Selena, because that's how Dorian is seeing it right now. Like, no matter how much Dorian might think Kale likes Selena, he also sees Kale being an asshole sometimes too. Again, not that it's not earned. Selena is sneaking around. However, Kale's bitterness comes across as jealousy. Kale knows he doesn't stand a chance against Dorian's looks and status. It's this interesting dynamic because ultimately Selena has more feelings for Kale than she does for Dorian. And the superficialness of Dorian is what maybe steals the attention, but that's not long lasting, as we know, having read this book. I find it very interesting because in this is where Dorian finds power. And it's the only place he has power, because even though he's lost the conversation, he's lost the sparring, he isn't he doesn't have power with his mom or dad. Ultimately, at least he's got his looks to get what he wants.
Whether we said it in a past episode or earlier this episode, time and space does not exist here. Kale, we talked about before that Kale has probably been passed up by women all the time for Dorian. I mean, black hair, blue eyes, good looking, doomed. My entire 20s was lost to that. Though, and there's something about guys who have black hair and blue eyes that know they're the biggest fuck boys. Like, they know they're a catch, regardless of how ugly they may actually be. And then you add the fact that Dorian's hot, you're screwed. And a prince, you're screwed. So Kale can't even begin to fathom the idea that maybe Selena would be interested in him. And it's an automatic, well, of course she would be interested in Dorian. Before he can even entertain that, how can he block Dorian?
Right. Yeah. The chapter ends with Dorian alone in his tower. Quote, he had the entire tower to himself, though his chambers occupied only the upper level. They provided a haven from everyone, but today they just felt empty. I think this is a great symbol of Dorian's life and his associations that we were talking about earlier in the scene. Dorian has so much privilege, but it is as hollow as the tower is literally hollow. Like, you have this entire tower and you only take up the upper level.
Yeah.
And it's a great visual representation of how isolated and alone Dorian is. And what this is doing is it's allowing this sparring, it's allowing this conversation to really highlight just how lonely Dorian is. And he's becoming more and more cognizant of that loneliness. And so it's not just rebellion, it's feeling empty, feeling disconnected that drives him towards Selena.
Yeah. Listener, if you can hear things in the background, it's for the first time this year raining in LA.
Thank God.
All right, let's get into some breadcrumbs and broomsticks. In chapter 23, when Selena wakes up from her nightmare, she notices that, quote, her windows were shut, an odd draft from somewhere in her room kissed her face, smelling strangely of roses. We talked about this throughout the episode. However, just want to reiterate that roses was a huge breadcrumb.
And the draft foreshadows the secret passageways.
Yep.
Still in chapter 23, when Selena is reminded that it is Sam Heughan, she asks Cale, quote, and will you be summoning the dead to you this haunted night or lighting a bonfire with your companions? Cale responds, I don't partake in such superstitious nonsense. Selena, be careful, my cynical friend. The gods and the dead are closest to the earth this day. They can hear every nasty comment you make, which is why she talks to Elena tonight.
Yeah. Still in chapter 23, when Cale asks Selena what she's going to do during Sam Heughan, Selena tells him, quote, I worship in my own ways. Perhaps I'll make a sacrifice or two of my own. This is hinting at a heritage that's different from his own because she's Fae.
After attending church on Sam Heughan, Dorian runs into Selena. Quote, Dorian turned around a hedge, almost crashing into a figure of blue-green velvet. It was the same color of the mountain lake. That gem-like shade that didn't quite have a name, not to mention the dress was about 100 years out of fashion, which is appropriate for someone about to speak to the dead.
Then finally, in chapter 23, quote, but kneeling before it was Cain. His head bent. He focused on something on the ground. At the sound of their footsteps, Cain's head shot up. He grinned broadly and stood. His hands were covered in dirt. Selena looked at the spot where Cain had just been kneeling. He dug out the dirt packed into the hollows of the strange mark in the flagstone, making the mark clearer.
I forgot to add a note to that one.
I mean, that's because Cain is one of the, he's the one who's doing all the things. He's possessed.
Yeah.
He's digging.
So in chapter 24, when Selena is in the tomb, she realizes that the sarcophaguses or sarcophagi are for her ancestors. Quote, then this man was Gavin, the first king of Adarlan, and this was Elena, the first princess of Terrasen, Brannon's daughter, and Gavin's wife and queen.
So Brannon, we all know, is her ancestor. We also know Brannon ends up being Lydia's ancestor in Crescent City. So I have to always take a beat to be like, okay, who is who? What is what's going on here? So Brannon ends up going to, his daughter goes over to Adarlan. So just keep that in check. Then some more lore in chapter 24, quote, she knew that sword. She'd stepped towards the treasure. It was the legendary sword of Gavin, the sword that had wielded in a fierce war that had almost ripped apart the continent, the sword that had slain the Dark Lord Erewhon.
Yeah. That's a lot of information we need to remember.
Yeah, it's important stuff. It just ends up being so confusing later on. It's so much good information is given here, but we're just flagging it, remembering it. We'll come back. This is plot.
Yeah. Again, still in chapter 24, while Selena is talking to Elena, quote, the nausea returned. She hoped Elena wouldn't speak of what her heart refused to remember, hoped that the queen wouldn't mention what she had spent so long forgetting. SJM is shoving Selena's true identity down our throats.
Yeah.
Jac left a note.
So we don't plan who reads what.
Yeah.
On which one does breadcrumbs. We'll just shove, put something there, and then whoever reads it, the quote is, I'll read it.
Yeah. This is your note.
It says, deep throat me with your breadcrumbs. But it feels obvious. It's so funny because I'm sure as a writer, she probably was writing this thinking, is this too obvious? Is everyone to just know? Shoving it down your throats.
Yeah. I mean, we know something's going on, right? But we can't fathom what it might be.
Exactly. In chapter 25, in her dream, Selena sees a door with a, quote, a bronze knocker in the form of a skull in its center. It seemed to be smiling. Mort! We're about to get some Mort!
Still in chapter 25, when Selena enters Elena's tomb, she notices that the floor, quote, was covered in stars, raised carvings that mirrored the night sky, and the ceiling depicted the earth. Why were they reversed? Does this perhaps foreshadow the end of Kingdom of Ash?
Potentially. Finally, in chapter 26, when Dorian and Cale talk about the king, quote, no, I haven't the slightest idea. I remember him leaving like this when we were children, but it hasn't happened for some years now. I bet he's doing something particularly nasty. The last time he left, he got infected with the Valg, and yes, he is doing something particularly nasty.
All right. So we did not solicit listener thoughts for this episode, so we're going to jump to the question of the week, which is, we are now at the halfway point of the book, so let's talk about character development for our three main characters, Celaena, Cale, and Dorian. But before we do, Jac wants to read something.
A listener actually sent this when Amy was reading Throne of Glass. This was her note from 2022, three.
Yeah.
Day 1 of Throne of Glass. Got halfway through chapter 13. Hot take. Dorian is a prototype for Rhys, and Celaena is a more realistic 18-year-old than Farah in terms of maturity and funnier. So I just
For writing that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of note that because, we're halfway through, and I think that I said something in the middle of this episode about how SJM is making a very classic book and, beginning, middle, end. So we're in the middle. And when we think about character development, I think we're seeing some very good character development. When we met Celaena, she was so cocky of herself, it was annoying. However, it was hiding a bunch of trauma. Now here she is, still with the trauma, working through that trauma, and she's cocky with herself, but it's not as aggressive as it was before. That's because she's healing and she's working through some things. Then you have Cale, who did not trust Celaena at all to begin with, and I think Celaena is making him question quite a bit of his own everything, his own, what he believes in. And then Dorian, I argue the first bit of development we're seeing was this episode, thank God, which makes sense because we're halfway through and we're seeing him actually use his brain a little bit. So that is my, we're getting that, everyone's done that one step forward development.
Yeah, and I don't, when we think about character development, especially when it comes to series and characters we're going to spend a lot of time with, there's character development in the book sense, and then there's character development in the series sense, right? And sometimes there's going to be slower movement in the book than there will be from a series perspective. And so I do think, to Jac's point, as readers, I think what's happening is we're uncovering the layers of Celaena, and we're also uncovering the complexity she's capable of, which is, I should hate these men. They represent everything that has done wrong to me in my life. But I also recognize that they're humans and they're separate from that. And I think that's a complex place to be at the age of 18 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was going to make a comparison to a different series, but I will not. I'm going to keep it Throne of Glass. Again, to the points we've made before, it makes sense that we've seen a shift in Celaena's confidence, that we're starting to see her recognize reality for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited to see how she deals with this idea of, fate has something bigger planned for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy you brought up the idea of series character development versus book, because I think when we think Throne of Glass, we immediately assume the book, and we think about the last 2 books, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where everyone's mind goes, are the last ones, and it's like, it was heartbreaking and everything wonderful happened, and there's so many more characters and other magical things that were happening that it's hard not to come back to the very beginning, to just a single book, and say, what did SJM do with this one book? And it's a well-structured book so far. It's doing what it needs to do. We're getting the layers, we're getting the growth, and it's just kind of pulling people back to the beginning, to the simplicity when it was just these 3 people, and what that means and what it's doing, and how what we're seeing here will impact everything. But yeah, it's good to have the exercise of, what are we doing? That is a one book analysis.
Right. And I think that's important because we were at a book event recently and someone was like, I'm reading Throne of Glass and I'm in Heir of Fire and I just can't do it. I just can't finish the series. I'm going to DNF. Yeah. And we're like, everyone's response, and you said this to me when I started the series as well, just get through the first 3 books, it gets better. And that's what people say about ACOTAR. Just get through the first book, it gets better in the second book. And I think people really sleep on the amount of intricate, very minute detail work SJM does with her characters in her first few books. And I think we're seeing that here. I think there's a lot more layers in this book than you and I even realized before we started analyzing it, because I did not expect to be recording for 3 to 4 hours every episode. There is so much meat in these books for us to dissect, and the movements are small, but they are necessary in order to build the foundation for the rest of the series. You couldn't take these characters and throw them into Empire of Storms and expect them to be capable of the same thing.
It's so funny because it's like we were talking about these movements are small and minute, but at the same time we talk, like when we first, before we even started recording, I felt like, oh, everything is so overt and in your face, and it feels like a young author, and you can tell this was written when she was 16. And now here I am thinking, you know what? I'm taking back my words. Now, it still reads like a young author. I still think ACOTAR is one of her best written books. You can tell she's written a lot by that point, and she's learned. And there's the things that she has here, you can tell that she's learned and developed elsewhere. That being said, for a new author, this is a really good book.
Yeah. For a debut novel,
yeah,
there is so much in here that you don't necessarily expect from a debut novel.
And it's okay if things are over. It doesn't have to be a Crescent City level complicated. It's okay that things are a little bit more simple. It's a lot to sink our teeth into, and I applaud her. And so I'm happy we did the halfway check. I can't believe we're halfway through.
I know.
We're halfway done.
We are halfway done. And episode 1 airs in 2 days.
Oh my God. This is exciting. So yeah, when we're recording this, it's still January.
You guys, January 2025 has been the longest January of all Januaries.
It's been the longest year this month. It has been, yeah. I'm not saying anything about where it's going to be in the future when this comes out. I'm not jinxing shit. I learned not to. But yeah, I'm happy. Hopefully we've gained some new followers this season. Hopefully we've sparked people's interest. If there's anything, you guys liked, tell us, because we're just talking into the void. No one knows what we've mentioned.
We need positive affirmation.
But genuinely though, because at this point we've gone 5 episodes going into the dark, speaking into nothingness, and just hoping for the best.
You and I did the first season.
Yeah, and so I'm like, I hope people like it. Now for episode 6, we'll have an idea of what people think, which will either hurt us or help us.
Yeah, that's very true.
Words of affirmation is our thing. So yeah, let's sign off.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Book Talk for Book Talk with Jac and Amy. Next week, we will be exploring chapters 27 through 31 of Throne of Glass.
We encourage you to rate and subscribe to our show on your preferred podcast listening platform. We would also love to hear your thoughts based on today's conversation. You could submit your comments to our forum at booktalkforbooktalk.com for a chance to have your feedback discussed during a future mini episode or a Patreon exclusive episode.
If you're enjoying the podcast, please visit our website, booktalkforbooktalk.com, to view our latest merch and learn about supporting the show through Patreon or Venmo. You can follow us on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube at the handle BookTalkForBookTalk. Bye. Okay.
It switched for me, but I can move you over here, and now that's better.
Okay. I mean, I don't care. I can just lower the whole thing and not look at you at all.
Well, wow. Rude.
I mean, I get distracted. I do like looking at your face, so.
Is there thunder outside, or is that?
I don't think so.
Okay. It's either a truck or thunder. I think that is thunder.
Yeah, I hear it too.
That's funny.
Out my window.
Yeah. Before we do, Nicole sent us a text saying it's hailing outside.
Oh my God.
I'm supposed to go to Disneyland.
I think you guys might need to not go.